So this week, Felix and I are closing the doors on a chapter that has been part of our lives for over a decade. After 11 years, we are saying goodbye to Allies. So for those of you who don't know, Allies was our venue, has been our venue in downtown Los Angeles for the last decade. But even calling it a venue feels too small because it was a business, a home, a ministry, a creative space, a gathering space, a place where ideas and dreams became a reality. Over the years, we have hosted everybody from global brands like Nike and Reebok to small startups launching their very first products. We've hosted Allen Iverson, we've hosted church services, Bible studies, pop-ups, worship nights, fundraisers, corporate events, brand launches, literally everything that you can imagine. And thousands upon thousands of people have walked through these doors over the last decade. But perhaps the greatest gift that Allies has given us wasn't the events, far from it. It was the time that we were given. It was what allowed Felix and I to stay close to home. It allowed us to build a life where Lion wasn't an interruption to our work, but yet a part of it. He grew up here in this wild creative space. He learned to skateboard here. He learned to walk here. He attended church here. He watched us build something from the ground up here. And some of my favorite memories aren't even the biggest events, but the smallest, seemingly insignificant moments, the ordinary Tuesdays, the quiet mornings, the late nights, the conversations after everybody had left. The moments that nobody photographed, the moments that became our life. And if I'm honest, there was a season where I thought that we were going to lose it all. We were pretty sure of it because COVID nearly destroyed the businesses and all the businesses down the street. Like so many others, we watched everything come to a standstill, and there were moments where it felt impossible. But somehow, God carried us through. Not forever, but for long enough for one more run, long enough to finish well. And when we started this business, I was 24 years old, which seems wild to me to say. And we're closing it now at 36 years old. And in these years, the business wasn't the only thing that grew. We did too, as individuals and as a couple. We evolved as people and as leaders and as parents and as followers of Jesus. And the journey, it wasn't always pretty. There were setbacks and mistakes and hard lessons and seasons where we questioned everything. But it was ours to question. And as an immigrant, I'm incredibly proud of that. Proud that we built something from nothing. We're proud that we created a space that served our city for over a decade. Proud that we stayed in the fight when it would have been so much easier to just walk away. I'm also honest enough to acknowledge that downtown LA today is not the downtown LA that we moved into all those years ago. I've watched the governance of the city decline in ways that have been heartbreaking. We've watched safety deteriorate. We've watched businesses leave one after the other. I've watched human suffering become the daily reality on nearly every single corner of the city. And this is coming from somebody who used to do solo runs through downtown without a second thought. But today, what I see is often the visible destruction of humanity unfolding in plain sight. People are struggling. People have been abandoned. People are forgotten. And it's impossible to not feel the weight of that when you are in the city. And as a mother, it changes how I think. As parents, it changes how we think, because our son deserves better than to grow up in an environment like this. Our city deserves better. The people that are suffering deserve better. And while those realities aren't the sole reason that this chapter is ending, they are part of the story. There are chapters that end because they fail. And then there are chapters that end because they have fulfilled their purpose. And sometimes we assume that every ending is a loss. But what if it's just a completion? What if it's not something that's being taken from you, but it's something that is being finished? I've been thinking a lot about Moses as I reflect on this season. And In Exodus 17, Moses stood on a hill while the Israelites fought the Amalekites. And the scriptures say that whenever Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered them, it was when the enemy gained ground. And then eventually, further along in the story, Aaron and Hur had to come alongside him and held up his arms. And I love that story in the scriptures because it reminds me that even leaders get tired. Even people carrying vision get tired. Even people doing exactly what God asked them to do get tired. But then later in the story, Moses finds himself wandering in the wilderness, and what should have been a short journey became 40 years. I'm going to read to you from Deuteronomy 8:2 says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart." To humble and test you, right? The wilderness wasn't wasted. The delay wasn't wasted. The wandering, it wasn't wasted. God was doing something all along the journey. And I believe that is true of allies. Every event, every challenge, every difficulty in each season, the late nights, all of the miracles, and there were so many of them, none of it was wasted. God used it all. And now, as we close this chapter, as we choose to close this chapter, I don't feel sadness as much as I feel peace. Because there's a difference between walking away from something because you're defeated and walking away because God said it's time. One comes from frustration and the other comes from a place of peace. And I've learned that peace is one of God's greatest gifts. Peace doesn't always mean certainty. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean you know every detail of what's next. It simply means that you trust the one leading you there. Abraham followed God's timing. David followed God's timing. Joseph followed God's timing. Even Jesus waited for God's timing. In John 2, Jesus said, "My hour has not yet come." What leadership in that statement. Even the Son of God refused to move ahead of the Father's timing. So who are we to think that we should? And the older I get, the more I realize that life isn't about squeezing every ounce out of every chapter. It's about knowing when God is calling you to the next one. Because obedience isn't always about holding on. Sometimes obedience is releasing what you love, trusting that the same God who authored the last chapter is already writing the next one. So today, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to every person who attended an event, every client, every friend, volunteer, church member, each person who walked through these doors. You were all part of the story. And while this chapter is ending, the impact remains because what God builds through obedience doesn't disappear, it multiplies. And as we close the doors to allies, we're not grieving what was. Because what God builds through obedience doesn't disappear, it multiplies. And as we close the doors to allies, we're not grieving what was. We're celebrating what God did here. We're stepping forward, believing that if He was faithful then He will be faithful now. We're celebrating what God did. And we are stepping forward into this next season, believing that if He was faithful then He will be faithful now. And until next time, let's love more, and we'll see you at the next PSA. Okay, wow, last PSA in Allies. This is very, very surreal, but I'm grateful for the timing, and I think we feel so much peace. Thank you to all of you that have been here from the beginning, because we started PSA and these messages from this very place. We have an entire playlist, over 200, for you and those around you. Definitely give them a listen, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.